So we've talked about, just to review, we've talked about customers, we've talked about business models, we've talked about teams and how to build those, but one of the things we haven't explicitly talked about is financial resources. So you need people and you need some financial resources. And the question is, where do you go to get them, and what are they like? And that's going to be what our panel is going to be about. But I'm going to run a short video from the Kauffman Foundation that talks about where financing comes actually for most entrepreneurial ventures. Kauffman is the largest foundation dedicated to entrepreneurship, and they fund all sorts of initiatives around the teaching and sponsorship of entrepreneurship. So.
Most young companies need money, which may or may not come as a big surprise, but they do. The number one source they get money from is from their own savings. Whether it's a few $100s or even thousands of dollars, that's what we tend to tap first. And a lot of companies don't get money from any other place. They get money from their own savings, and then after that, they're lucky enough to be cash flow positive. They're profitable. So we talk a lot as if all companies require all sorts of external capital, and the reality is that more than half of young companies get all their funding from a combination of founder savings and then cash flow from the business, and we're at it. Next up on the list is another one that catches, I think, people by surprise, and that's credit cards. Almost every young company you can think of, to one degree or another, was funded on credit card. And it is the single largest source of capital for young companies after founder savings. And then the next place where they tend to get money is from friends and family. After I've tapped out my credit card and I've used up all my savings, I turn to people I know and say, hey, will you help me? And that's the third biggest source of capital. And then the next place is banks. And the banks are a totally weird situation because with banks, they get a lot of attention, but they actually fund very, very few young companies. But it's not their fault. You have to think about the way bank lending works and how shareholders want banks to lend. They want them to lend money against secured assets. And young companies don't have any security. They have nothing to secure it against. And the joke in the industry is you can get all the bank funding you want as a startup as long as you don't need it. And then the last piece is venture capitalists. They get the lion's share of the attention, which in some ways is warranted. You know, your Googles and Apples and FedExes and many others all have venture capital money inside of them. But the reality is, and this is from Kauffman research, less than 20% of the fastest growing companies in the United States took any venture money. And that's not because the VCs wouldn't give it to them, it's because they didn't want it or didn't need it, because they had all those other sources. I don't need money, and I certainly don't need money on these terms. Because, you know, venture capitalists, unlike banks, they don't lend against secured assets. They give you money in exchange for shares, so they take some of your company away. So my answer is if you don't need it, definitely don't get it. There's no question the venture industry has become staid. The irony is it's intended to fund disruption, and yet it's an industry that had become complacent. And interestingly, over the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen the emergence of other mechanisms for funding, like AngelList, like these kinds of peer-to-peer funding sources, as people increasingly provide capital in smaller amounts, but more people doing it directly. Having said all of that, though, venture capitalists are hugely important for those young companies that don't have access to bank money, but are growth companies. They have the prospect of being a $5 million or a $10 million company in a couple of years, and they need that growth capital to get there quickly. So it's a race. And the way you play the race is by getting money from people like venture capitalists who give you the money so you can compete with other people who are racing as fast as you are. If you can run a company off cash flow and some combination of credit card, your own savings, and friends and family, you know, Bob's your uncle. Run. You know, keep all the equity because, you know, there's no better thing than being in full control of your own destiny.
So that's to put in context that there are a variety of different sources that people have used. What isn't talked about there are some sort of non-equity funding type things. So there are things like business plan competitions. And I've seen a number of companies go through a number of competitions to get the funding to get to the first product or prototype to go raise money or to get customer financing. That is, there are customers that will actually give you money to help solve a problem. And in fact, a typical way of a company getting going and to be very close to customers is to start as a consulting business, solving their problems, understanding what their issues are, and funding it through that. The problem with that is it's very lucrative to be in a consulting position, and if you have to switch then to a product, the transition from getting a lot of money for consulting to getting a little money for a lot of products is a whole set of dynamics that gets tricky. Other things in the technology-related areas are these SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research Grants. Any federal government agency that does over a certain amount of outside research is required to give a certain proportion of that to, I think, 2.5% to small business, on the theory that, hey, those are the ones that are innovative. And that can work well, but you have to worry about whether the government retains rights in what you do. So there's a little tricky dance you have to do there. But NIH, NSF is different, National Science Foundation. All of the other agencies that do research are doing research against their mission. So I'm the Air Force, I need better parachutes. And so they're very much aligned with what they're doing. And that may or may not align with who your market and customer are. NSF, though, doesn't have a mission other than to advance the health and well-being of Americans. So they'll fund a whole range of things because they don't intend to buy the stuff from you. So it's a more flexible kind of thing. And if it works, it can be a good way to do it. It can be a little frustrating sometimes because of the hoops you have to go through. There's a phase 1, which you can get, I think, $150,000, and then there's a phase 2, which can be, I think it's up to $750,000 or $1 million now. And so there are processes of going through that. And I'm sure the panel will perhaps talk about that and some other things. And so to introduce our panel tonight, we have Julianne Zimmerman, who among her many accomplishments, I always remind her, she was in the astronaut program. So take it away.
Yes. So I was a finalist twice in the NASA astronaut selection process, which is not exactly the same thing as being an astronaut. But it's asymptotically approaching, so good enough, I guess, for this context. I'd really like to invite up, go ahead, Joe. I'd like to invite up the panel to get situated. As Joe said, and as you saw in the Kaufman animation, there's a kind of fetishistic way that venture capital gets talked about as though it's the only or the best source of capital for young growing companies. And in fact, the video that you saw, the animation, is a few years old, and the numbers that I've seen recently range between 12 and 16%. So well under 20% of the fastest growing companies, not just of all companies, but of the fastest growing companies in the country have received any venture capital at all. And so if you've come this evening hoping to get a primer on how to meet VCs, this is not going to satisfy your wishes. We're instead going to talk about as many as possible of the sources of capital you can and should explore depending on the kind of business you're in, the sector, the rate of growth, your ability to generate revenues, et cetera. So before we dive into that, I'd just like to give each of the panelists a moment to explain to you just enough about their current and past endeavors so you'll have a sense of their perspective and their experience with capital in the startup realm. And then we'll proceed with the conversation from there. So Lily, could we start with you, please?
Absolutely. Hi, guys. My name's Lily Macumber. I work at a funding portal company called Net Capital, which is based out of downtown Boston. Like Julianne said, we're an alternative source of funding for startups. Before that, I was actually at M.I.T, so it's great to be back. I was working at M.I.T Solve, which is a social impact incubator marketplace for social impact startups, and there I was working in the corporate partnerships realm of things, working with corporations to help match them with different entrepreneurs who kind of as we were saying before, satisfied their business needs. And then, I'm also an MBA student at Babson College, which is a great entrepreneurship school in the area. And then I also have my own nonprofit that I started as well.
Hi, my name is Edison Almeida. Short summary, I am an engineer turning into salesperson, turning into entrepreneur, and now turning into corporate investor. Probably corporate angel investor is the best way to characterize it. So definitely, being able to experience a real broad set of perspectives as I transition from one phase to another. And currently, I'm with Schneider Electric Ventures. It's a 500 million euro fund that's basically looking for disruptive innovations in the energy space, as we call it, the new electric world that's being built with the low carbon infrastructure, and identifying market opportunities, entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial teams, and helping them build their ventures, scale, and have access to market. So other than that, in terms of my background, I started in telecommunications. From telecommunications doing engineering work, I actually also went to Babson College and got my MBA there. That's when I realized that one of my biggest skill set gaps was commercial experience. And as I left my MBA, I decided to get a job in sales. And that was great and did pretty well. And after doing that for a couple of years, I basically had an opportunity to figure out how to get fired and become an entrepreneur. And that's when I found my first source of financing, AKA unemployment. And that worked really well. There is a little story about that, which is really unbelievable. But then ended up starting one business, did that for a couple of years. That gave me the basis for a discovery that was the opportunity to invite a couple of people to become co-founders with me, started a second business, which turned out to be a venture backed by not only traditional venture capital, but also corporate VCs. And I ran that for 7 years. And then after that period of time, a couple of private equity folks bought control of the business. They've been running it for the last 2 years. I took a couple of years off just to decompress. And then about 5 months ago, received this opportunity to be part of Schneider Electric Ventures team. So looking forward to sharing this experience here today with you guys.
Cool. My name's Kerry Bowie. I'm background in energy and environmental. From here, so I was 1E here at MIT, and I did a master's at University of Michigan. I went and worked in the semiconductor industry for about 10 years doing manufacturing, environmental, safety, and health work. I came back here to see about a girl. When I did, I came back and did business school at the I guess the second best entrepreneurship MBA in the area. I can say that with the Babson folk here. So I came back to Sloan and did my MBA here, and I sort of went a non-traditional route. So I went and worked in state government. So I worked for Governor Patrick doing environmental and energy work, and also worked into the Baker administration for about 1.5 years. And so I actually left, and I am now a consultant. I was doing work in brownfields, cleaning up contaminated properties, in environmental justice, as well as some food policy work. And what I saw, and we can talk about this a little bit later, is when we talk about some of these funding sources, it's a little bit different for low-income, Black, brown people. There's not some of the same access to those first areas. And I think I saw that when I was talking about climate change and greenhouse gases. The people I was talking to were really interested in not environmental justice, but economic justice and social justice. Interested in jobs and better education and a number of those things. So we started a social impact consulting practice, really to help startups to grow and to give them access to technical assistance and also try to get them connected to capital. In addition to that work, I And part of what got me doing that is I've been a mentor for the venture mentoring service here for about 10 years. Now I'm also an adjunct instructor with the National Science Foundation, so sort of ahead of that SBIR money that Joe was talking about. I'm on the investment committee of the Boston Hadzima project. That's a different way of funding, and I also just joined the advisory board for a social impact venture fund coming out of Sloan. So not technically affiliated with the Institute, but it's mostly Sloan he's doing investing, similar to Castor Ventures. So I'm happy to talk about all of that.
Awesome. So as you can see, we have a very knowledgeable panel. As your moderator, I'm one of the partners at Reinventure Capital here in Boston, which is a social impact investment practice focused on companies that are at expansion stage, so not startups, a bit further downstream. And we focus particularly on companies that are led and substantially controlled by women and/or people of color for many of the reasons Carrie already touched on. I've previously been a seed stage investor, and I've been a co-founder and a board member and mentor to any number of companies. And a long time before that, I was an aerospace engineer. I was course 16 and course 21 when I was an undergrad here. And what I have seen as the sort of evolution from the time when I was a student to today is the real shift in thinking from just bringing technology out into the world and commercializing by any number of means to this kind of hyper focus on VC. And so we will touch on VC tonight, but we're really going to try to address as many of these other funding considerations and pathways as we can touch on in the time available. So before we do that, you've heard a bit about us and who we are. I want to make sure that we have a sense of who you are. So how many of you have already launched or are in process of launching a startup? A fair number. How many of those are B2B? And how many are B2C? Any B2G? Okay. And are those primarily coming out of the research you're doing as part of your studies or your work here at the Institute? Or are they unrelated to your work here at the Institute? Okay. And have any of you started raising capital or generated revenues yet? Okay. So it gives you a little bit of an idea. There's obviously a lot more polling we could do, but it gives you some sense. So let's start off. If you don't mind, panelists, I'd like to just start off with explaining a little bit about what some of these things are. So Carrie, if you don't mind, we'll start with you since you're doing work with the NSF program here at MIT. Tell us a little bit about how government funding works for startups and for new enterprises.
Yeah. So government funding typically is what we say is non-dilutive. So, if we talk about VCs, they want their money back. They want, and it's an investment. And so it's a trade-off. And so I think you're thinking of everything that way. Government typically is doing it for the common good. There's a reason that they're doing it. And so I'll just speak specifically about NSF. I think Joe talked a little bit about it. It's not like they're Air Force doing parachutes or jet engines or battery packs to get certain places. It's a little bit of everything. And so it goes across a number of different cases. And so you typically have those different levels, phase ones, phase zeros, all those different things. What we do in the program that I work in is we know that the NSF gives out a lot of money each year. And so what they're trying to do through the I-Corps program or Innovation Corps is really just try to see if the really cool things that you tech people in this room are coming with out of these labs, does anybody care? Is it, is society going to get their taxpayer dollars back by investing in you? And it's really just trying to help that process along. And so I think, and that's part of what we do as consultants, even outside of I-Corps, is we're trying to provide some technical assistance. We're trying to help to give some guidance. It's not just about throwing money at problems. If you have money, you really don't know what to do with it, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so the whole process is one of product market fit, is one of how do you really identify your customer segments, how do you really figure out what your value proposition is, but the real, if I boil it down, the real big question is, does anybody care? Will anybody use this? Is the real cool idea you have actually commercial? And if so, then what they do is they'll give you money to do it. And this program is, like $50,000 to really just go out and do that, to go and listen, to go and, find your customers and see what they want. Because that's probably the most important thing that you can do is listen to your customer. And so once you do that, that opens you up or puts you, because these are competitive processes, it puts you at the front of the line. And it makes you, that much easier for you to get that funding. Like Joe said, that's now you're talking $750,000 and $1 million and so forth, so on and so forth. Does that help?
Yeah, and
Okay.
this is grant funding.
It's really grant. This is you, and this is why we want to be good stewards of this money. These are your tax dollars. That's what, government is, there's not a big bucket of government money. That's coming out of your pocket. And so it's coming out of your pocket, and so we want to make sure we're putting it, to use in the right places. And what they've done before is, you got a good idea coming out of the lab, they just give you the money, and most of those ideas fail because it's really great tech, but for companies, it's really about team, that product or service, that tech, and it's really about that market. Does somebody want that tech, that product, that service that you have?
Thank you.
problem.
And Edison, I know that you've worked with some of our Massachusetts-based granting agencies. Can you share a little bit about those and about, how do they get involved and what kinds of support do they provide in addition to capital?
Sure, absolutely. So perhaps one of the best things about being here in Massachusetts is that we definitely have a government that's very vested in the development of the Commonwealth as a leader in energy efficiency. So in order to do that, about 10 years ago, with Governor Deval Patrick, the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, MASCC, was created to foster economic development in the Commonwealth. And as part of that, they came up with several different programs that could range from grants that would be awarded depending on a specific goal for the Commonwealth. For instance, right now, they have a program going on in regards to transportation. So we're going through this shift from fossil fuel-based transportation to electrifying transportation. So they're asking for, what are your business ideas that could be commercialized, and we can help you, validate that, do the customer discovery and customer validation process. And here you go, a grant of $45,000, perhaps even more than that. Or just to basically accelerate that whole path from validating your core hypothesis for your businesses and actually interacting with customers. To a range of, MASCC has also provided several private companies with project finance. So the example there is financing lots of solar deployments to wind farms. And that's usually a loan, so it's going to get repaid over time. And there's a whole financial analysis behind that. To a third area, which is basically equity investments, which was one of the avenues that I was able to pursue in my startup, where my CEC basically became an equity investor. They have a department that's in essence an institutional investment team that's looking into co-investing with a lead investor and identifying businesses that not only have a unique value proposition and a competitive advantage, but also that would be established in Massachusetts and help with the economic development in the Commonwealth. And in that case, it's traditional equity investment, venture capital, with all the terms associated with that, and some covenants and side letters that basically establish that you can have access to this capital as long as you meet the requirements established by the Commonwealth. One of them, keeping your management team in Massachusetts, making sure that you comply with all that. But if for whatever reason you decide to move elsewhere, just pay it back and everything is going to be fine. So these are some of the options. And then, of course, there's the Department of Energy Resources that has granted several awards for different projects that were priorities established by the government of Massachusetts. For instance, one program was related to the deployment of energy storage assets, so it was called ACES, and that basically comes down to grants for the deployment of new technology, and with the expectation that grants is going to jumpstart a new emerging market.
Awesome, thank you. And so in addition to Mass CEC and Mass DOER funding, there are other agencies as well and other programs at the state level here in Massachusetts and in other states as well that, again, provide this kind of catalytic capital to advance the development of companies that are advantageous to that state economy. So those are always well worth looking into. As you start to think about developing a product or a service, there are also opportunities to have lots of crowd platforms. And Net Capital is one kind of crowd platform. Lily, could you tell us about the various kinds of crowd platforms that exist?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm sure everyone in the room has probably heard of crowd platforms such as Indiegogo and Kickstarter, where it's more product-based, and you're providing your backers with either your product or a T-shirt or something. And so Net Capital kind of takes that idea and flips it, and it actually also relates back to the government. Kind of in 2016, the government rolled out its final iterations of the Jobs Act, so the Jumpstart Our Businesses Act. And with that came a whole new set of regulations on who could invest in what types of companies. So, since the Jobs Act came out, now everyday people, unaccredited investors, everyone in this room can invest in private companies up to a certain amount each year. They can invest in startups, and they can invest in companies that, they think are going to take off, or that they, really like the entrepreneur for whatever reason. And the second thing it allows for as well is the ability to generally solicit. So with these new regulatory legislations that came out, companies who do this sort of a fundraise, it's called Reg CF, they can post on social media, they can advertise, they can market, they can really get the word out there and use the power of the internet to spread their ideas, utilize their own bases to help them fund their company. And I mean, when we talk about venture capital, it's hard in general. It's hard for an entrepreneur to get venture funded. It's even harder if, you're a woman or you're a person of color to get venture funded. And in 2018, my favorite thing that everyone literally knows is only 2% of female-founded companies got 2% of the total venture money that was out there. And so what studies have shown us is that these types of alternative funding, whether it be through grants or whether it be through government programs or even, crowdfunding, it makes it easier for those who have been typically disadvantaged by the venture system to raise money, also just based off in the way that we network. So there's studies done that women tend to network a lot differently than men, and these types of fundraising tends to work really well just based off of that alone.
So just to make sure that that's clear, if you're thinking about a Kickstarter or Indiegogo sort of model, that's essentially what we call pre-sales. So you have a product, or you have perhaps it's a service, usually it's a product, that you want to offer, and it costs money to manufacture, or it costs money to do the first proof version of the product before you can begin manufacturing it, or whatever it might be. Or you just want to test the market to make sure that people will actually buy your product. You mount a campaign on Kickstarter, Indiegogo, or one of several others, and people will commit to purchase your product, or in some cases actually pay up front for that product, which then means you don't need to get capital from other sources. Your customers are, in essence, funding the creation of your product. And then with entities like Net Capital, you're soliciting investments, which can be in the form of equity investments. They can also be in the form of repayable loans from a broad number of people you may know or not know. And this is important because the very, very frequently tossed around phrase, friends and family, refers to, people you know and can turn to give you or lend you money for your business. But as we know from demographics, many founders don't have those kinds of connections, right? So being able to turn to a much broader social network and build a community of backers for your business is a really great innovation the Jobs Act made possible. So there's a bunch of other forms of capital we could talk about. The Boston Hadzima Fund, which you mentioned in passing, Carrie, is another loan structured entity. There are also, in addition to government entities, there are also quite a few foundations who also will make grants to promising enterprises that serve their objectives. And many times, I just want to talk about the credit card notion that the Kaufman animation spoke about. Many times people will max out their credit cards. This is not something I hope you took away as a recommended course of action from that animation. Rather, the idea is that there are so many different credit card offers these days that have cashback options or other points or services or values that you can use to pay for things for your business, right? And so using those features in order to, first of all, postpone paying for things for 28 or 30 days, right? So if I don't have to pay for it today, but I can pay for it in 28 or 30 days, that buys me a little bit of time. But also to take the benefit of those things to offset your costs. And so before we talk about some of the myths and some of the pros and cons of the various forms of capital, I would really also love if the three of you could share some of the ways that new businesses can offset their costs, right? So one of the most famous, of course, is bootstrapping, which is, you basically have another gig that supports your living expenses, right, while you begin to generate revenues or while you begin to gain traction or secure grants or whatever it might be. What are some of the other ways you have seen businesses offset their expenses so they don't have to bring in that money?
Well, you can really be creative there, right? So I think bootstrapping is definitely the way that you get started, and it really comes down to, in essence, reevaluating your life and your personal finances and fastening the seatbelt and trying to get tie it into as many benefits as you can. So mention about leveraging safety nets is definitely helps you last longer. But one of the options, talking about Kickstarter, but it's probably one of the best options out there. It's so-called customer finance. And what is that? It's in essence, rather than going to a Kickstarter, you actually go after a customer, which could be a business customer, and present to them your value proposition, and they buy into that, and they're willing to pay you some upfront money that enables you to cover the costs of the development of that product, and even get to certain milestones that would trigger other payments, but at least enable you to get started and to get going. And then, of course, I think the key piece at the end of the day always comes down to people, the trust that you built, and developing these relationships is really going to make the big difference out there. So in order to be able to get this type of customer financing, you will need to develop a relationship with your customer that they really trust you and they are willing to provide that type of resource to you. But that's one of the avenues that I think has helped several businesses out there. And other than that, I would say that really being resourceful and creative about how to do things. Perhaps the core principle that is very useful to have on the back of your mind is you can't solve problems by throwing money at it. It really comes down to human creativity, resourcefulness, and being able to figure out how to overcome roadblocks. So sometimes you see that several challenges that are just in front of you, if you're able to basically be resourceful and pick other people's brain, build a network around you, build an ecosystem around you, you can leverage this resources, people, as assets that are going to provide you with either guidance, that being legal advice, that being business advice, whatever it is, putting together advisory board that it's not going to cost you anything, and of course you want to pay that back with some sort of stock participation options, whatever. Want to make sure that you compensate everybody fairly. But there are several non-cash options out there that could be leveraged to basically get your business going.
Thank you. So that kind of customer finance has a legal term. It's often called non-recurring engineering. So if you ever come across that phrase, NRE, non-recurring engineering, that's when a customer pays you to do some of the technical or product development or validation or customization or design, what have you, that will enable your concept to actually be workable for their purpose, right? And so that is an excellent way to offset your need for outside capital, not only because it reduces that capital demand and you're not spending your time raising money, but it builds that relationship with a great customer. And Lily, you wanted to add something.
Just kind of to go off of what Edison was saying as well, the foundation's everything. The foundation is, even if you're not looking for capital right now, the foundation is what's going to get you ultimately capital or pilots or traction in the future. And I think, one of the most important things to remember too is that when people ultimately do decide to either buy your product or invest in your company or for whatever reason give you some sort of monetary benefit and even spend their time working with you, they're not just investing in your company, they're investing in you as an entrepreneur. And I think that's one of the biggest things and misconceptions is that ideas are wonderful and there are groundbreaking ideas. I don't think I need to tell M.I.T. that there's groundbreaking ideas coming out of places like this every day, but at the end of the day, it's the people who make the ideas work, and it's the people who, people want to put their money towards and want to invest in ultimately.
That is a great segue. Carrie, I want to come back to you because you mentioned the M.I.T. Venture Mentoring Service. here in the Boston area, we really truly have an embarrassment of riches of free or extremely inexpensive resources. So we have incubators and accelerators and workshops and boot camps and peer groups and a whole host of other things. Could you share a little bit about MIT VMS and maybe touch on some of the others you are associated with or have been involved in?
Yeah. So, like I said, I think a big piece of it is, or there's sort of two pieces. There's technical assistance and there's capital. I think that's what typically entrepreneurs need. And I guess there's also an ecosystem. You know, if I wanted to say sort of a third piece of being able to bump and connect, and that might be, you know, physical or virtual. But in terms of technical assistance, it's really important. It makes a big difference. And so, like I said, I've been doing VMS for probably the past 10 years. Started when I was doing energy and environmental affairs work. A lot of it was, you know, I was part of the Patrick administration when we did all those sweeping pieces of green legislation, the Green Communities Act, the Global Warming Solutions Act, the Biofuels Bill, the Oceans Management, the Green Jobs Bill. And so the people at Sloan knew I was in government, and so I was really getting tapped by them, and I was pointing them in the right direction. But what I realized is there are a lot of other people at MIT and elsewhere, because I was a public servant, and so I'm working for the people. And so wanting to have those connections. The great thing about VMS is if you're affiliated with VMS, not VMS, with MIT in any way, so you're a student, you're an alum, you're faculty, you're a postdoc, whatever. Staff, any MIT affiliation, and you've got an idea, you can actually get teams of mentors to come and help you. And it's a team
For
mentoring
free.
process. For free, for free. So they're volunteering. There's a team of them, so you get at least 2. You typically are getting 90-minute sessions for people to go through, and in a sense, it's unlimited. You know, you can go on, you know, we don't want you coming every day or every week. You usually get homework, but you could literally come every, 2 months or 3 months. I've been on teams with people who are going through, say, Mass Challenge, and I did meet with them maybe, 4 times in a month as they were getting ready to pitch. And so that is a tremendous asset, because oftentimes this is your first time at the rodeo. And for a VMS person, they've seen, I don't know how many companies I've worked with. If I also, put in the NSF work, I know I've worked with hundreds of companies. So a lot of the things you're seeing, I've seen, and those other mentors have seen. And so it just behooves you to, I won't call it cheating, but get that leg up, get that other perspective from those other people. And they're typically volunteering to work with you, so they're interested in what you're doing. So if you're in food or retail or it's IT or you're doing something, the people who join your team are likely interested. Most of my teams earlier on were energy, or they were food or water, energy, climate change. So I got it. I understood what they were doing, and I probably had connections in the space. That's the same for, I think there are close to 200 mentors, and they're coming from all different walks. To go quickly, there are a lot of other things. I mentioned Mass Challenge. John, who started that, was a couple years behind me at Sloan. Pretty much took the 100K, competition out of MIT. Well, I think that's what it is. He took it out of MIT and offered it to others, because VMS and some of the things that we get here, you don't have this ecosystem everywhere else. And so tried to recreate that in terms of those mentors, in terms of those opportunities, but there are a lot of different things, and they're dilutive, accelerators. And so you think about a Y Combinator, you can think about a Techstars, you can think about, like a Learn Launch or a number of those programs, but there are also others that are out there where you can go through, like a Mass Challenge, that are not dilutive. Through my company, Masada Partners, we actually have a program called the Majira Project. that we do as a post-accelerator program targeted to founders of color or people in underserved communities, but we match them with consultants from the Boston Consulting Group to really help them do that. That's a non-dilutive piece. It's all free, no fees, no equity that we do that. But there are really programs like that almost for anything that you're doing. It's in the Boston area, sort of like MIT. You're drinking from the fire hose. So you just need to go and look around. But you can probably find something in your category that's doing that kind of work.
Yeah. It does take a little bit of poking around, but that is one of the great things that you'll find in programs like the MIT Venture Mentoring Service. And by the way, if you are a member of the MIT community in any way, shape, or form, and you are launching or pursuing an idea in preparation for launch, really you should be enrolled in VMS. You have an extraordinary set of extremely accomplished, talented mentors, basically acting as your personal advisory board for free. So very high value divided by zero, infinite value.
Yeah, just to add on that, I would almost think if you were starting a startup, at least sort of 3 organizations or, just at MIT, you should probably take some kind of course. Whether in your department, I know there's a course, whether it's course 6 or it's, Sloan or something like a new enterprises or a start this or start that. I know, I've been out for a while, but I know that there's some kind of course that you can take that will help you through the process. You should probably, do a competition. And so I guess 4 things. You should do a competition, and there's probably an accelerator that fits. Is it Delta V? Is it Design X? Is it Sandbox? Is it Start? Or is it Ideas? There's something that's there. So go through one of those, and also have VMS, because that's a different. I would say you should do those 4 things at a minimum, because that costs you nothing but your time, but it's time that you should be feeding into your enterprise, because you need to know your stuff better than anybody else. You're the expert. There are people who will know some things, tangential, but overall, you should have that thing wrapped in a bow such that people, I want to write you a check. I want to give you some money because I know you know what you're talking about.
Thank you. So there are other organizations around the Boston area. There are many competitions and hackathons and other places where you can access, again, very low cost or free opportunities to advance your idea. There are still many, many other options, but I think, we also do want to allow time to talk about angel and venture investing. And does everybody know the difference between angel and venture? Does everybody know those terms? Anybody not feel comfortable with those terms? Okay, so angels got that name based on a few amazing, amazing people who were like fairy godparents, who would basically say, Rebecca, I love what you're doing so much, I'm just going to write you a check. Off you go. Make it happen. Right? With no or almost no strings. And so they were called angels because it was like they dropped down from heaven to, make it possible for people to launch their companies. There are still a vanishingly small number of those people, but most of the time when you hear about angel investors, these are individuals, many of whom are former entrepreneurs themselves, not all, but they're people who are investing personally in early stage companies. And they might invest anywhere between a few $1,000s and $1 million. The people at that higher end are often referred to as super angels. But they're investing for a return. And there are terms attached, and they are expecting that they are going to make a return on those investments. And then there are angel groups. And those are groups of individuals who band together to make investments collectively. And then there are also affinity groups of angels. So Lily, you mentioned Castor and a couple of others, and we'll come to those in just a second. And then there are what we call institutional investors, and those are people who are investing either corporate money, as Edison is currently doing with his role at Schneider, or they're investing money that they have brought in from investors into their firm, right? So let's take them in that order. Let's work our way from angels to angel groups to institutional corporate VCs, and then we'll talk about institutional VC firms, right? So Lily, would you mind starting us off with angels and angel groups?
Yeah, for sure. So angels and angel groups, Julianne was saying before, there's a huge gamut of people who do a couple $1,000, $5,000, $10,000, all the way up, through $250 a lot of times, and probably over $250. But a lot of times, when companies are raising their round, they don't want to accept. It's a weird number, everything's a numbers game. They don't want to accept an amount that's too low because, that'll affect some sort of thing on their cap table or whatever. There's so many implications. And a lot of times what tends to happen is that companies lose out on those lower angels and, $5,000, $10,000 at the end of the day, it's still capital, and capital is kind of always great to an extent. So I think that in terms of leveraging those groups and leveraging even all sorts of angels is what I'm getting at. The levels of angels is definitely important, and I think definitely help entrepreneurs kind of especially get that initial funding.
So as you think about individual angels versus angel groups, or particularly affinity groups like Castor, which is M.I.T. affinity, obviously, how should founders think about those relationships, or how should they think about what those investors are expecting in return for their capital?
Yeah, I mean, kind of to my point before, I think investing in a person gets even closer to home when it's coming from an angel group. So, in the M.I.T. community, Castor Angels, that group, they want to invest in M.I.T. startups started by M.I.T. students. And at the end of the day, money is even more emotional at that point. They're expecting something back in terms of, whether it be equity or something happens with the product. I think that affinity groups kind of just tend to intensify the nature of angels and their affinity for giving money.
Good enough. So as angels are making investments, they're expecting typically like a 3x or better return on their investment. And that might come directly, or it might come way downstream after several other investors have gotten involved very frequently. So Edison, you've been on both sides of the table, right? You've raised money from angels and institutional investors, and now you're a corporate institutional investor. Can you talk a little bit about the different expectations of each of those parties and how founders should think about that?
Sure. So I guess perhaps one thing to make it clear, angel investing is not philanthropy, right? So there's that too. Perhaps we didn't talk about it. But basically, angel investors, well, perhaps just take a step back, and I guess this is one of the key points that everybody should be aware of, is whenever you get financed, if you're just getting money, you're not getting a good deal. Again, it goes back to that whole point of starting a business, growing it, running it. It's really hard. So you really should look for smart money or value-add investors that, in essence, they're going to put capital into your business, but that's just a lever. What you're really looking for is how they're going to help you get a new customer contract, how they're going to help you hire your next software person or your next person that's going to be part of your executive team, how they're going to help you connect with the other source of capital, other people, and how they're going to give you access to their personal networks and really make it go a lot farther than what you'd be able to do in your own, even if you had all the capital in the world. Because these are, it's called an intangible value, but it's like it's the best part of it. And as I started my journey trying to raise money, perhaps one of the key things that was a very valuable experience for me, I started to present and to pitch to several angel groups in town. And I would tell you that, probably made 20 presentations or so, didn't get any money whatsoever, but the feedback that I got and how they helped me shape and respond to questions that I hadn't thought about them before. And guess what? At the end of the day, those questions that I had to think through, when I tried to get my first customer, the customer had some of those questions, and then I was prepared to respond to the customer and be able to close the deal, which business exists because of customers, right? So at the end of the day, it's really about, business exists to create value, deliver value, and capture value. So it always starts with the customer. So now bringing this back a little bit to angel investing, it's just, you gotta figure out what is it that that person can bring to the table. And then you see if it's worthwhile to bring that person as a partner to your business that's going to, really be relevant. At the end of the day, they're going to be around for a long, long time. It's kind of getting into a relationship to a great extent. So you gotta be really aware of that. And in addition to that, another thing that you need to be very careful about is sometimes you go to these angel groups, and there are several people over there that they are, in essence, service providers. They're offering consulting services or whatever it is that you go expecting to raise capital. At the end of the day, you end up with a bill. So be very conscious about dealing with individuals and really being able to get that type of support. But there are several flavors of angels. It could be like individual investment, syndicated funds, as Julianne talked about, and there is definitely an expectation that you're going to pay that money back. And, of course, they are very aware that they can lose everything, and that's part of being an accredited investor. But, you gotta be mindful of if you're going to take angel money or venture money, which is kind of about the same ballpark, it's because you don't want a lifestyle business. You really want to get rocket fuel to accelerate the growth of your venture and be able to get an exit out of it. So if you really want to build a family business that's going to be 3-4 generations down the road still with your family, don't try to look for this type of investment. It's just not the right fit. So then that was about angel and some of the expectations there in terms of VC funds. The key change in dynamic is that you go from individuals that they're putting their own money to now you have a fund manager that's promising other people return on the investment, and then it's their job to make sure that you are going to produce results and they can get their return over there. So there are some interesting dynamics to be aware of. One of them is that first, it's not really their money. So they're mostly if they are finance professionals, they're just looking into the numbers game and how to get the return. And they are going to give you bandwidth and attention while things are working out. If things are not working out, they might throw you under the bus. And then the other key point in terms of that is, just managing those dynamics and expectations. And when you get into institutional investor like VC money, perhaps corporate money, you're really looking into then strategic types of motivations, right? So what is the key strategic umbrella that that business is pursuing, and how you fit into that picture, and why would they be interested in providing you with the resources, what they are they expect to get out of that. That could be not only financial return, but also a strategic advantage out of it. So that's a
Yeah, thank you. So a couple things you mentioned I just want to expand on slightly. So one is you mentioned it's very much a personal relationship, and you touched on that as well, Lily. People, and you mentioned also that it's a very close relationship. People often refer to having equity investors, particularly institutional VCs, as being like entering into a marriage. And that's true in some ways. It's an extremely intimate relationship. This person, and it's not just a firm or a corporation who's investing in your company, it's an actual person. This person is going to be in your underwear all the time, right? This is an extremely intimate relationship. And if it goes well, it's a happy one for both parties. You have good communication. You both achieve your objectives. You're very happy. Mm-hmm. However, in an unhappy marriage, God forbid this happens. Nobody wants it to happen. It's miserable and painful and expensive, but you can divorce. If you have an unhappy relationship with an equity investor, not only can you do nothing about that, you cannot divorce your investor, but they can have you removed from your own company, and this happens all the time. It happens a lot. So you need to understand that you are forming a very, very close relationship with someone who is going to have a great deal of power that you are not going to be able to reclaim from them, right? There's a big power differential. And so it's extremely important that you understand who that person is, what their objectives are, how your success and their success are intimately aligned. And moreover, if you are seeking a professional investor, ask other founders they've invested in. Talk to the founders in their portfolio to find out what their experience has been with that investor. What was it like during the initial conversations? What was it like during the due diligence? What was it like during negotiation? What's it been like after they invested? Make sure you really understand who you're getting involved with. Just so you know that there's also a time expectation. For a venture fund, they are expecting to return to their investors, called limited partners, LPs. They're expecting to return, typically they've promised a 10x return on each of their investors. So they're promising at least a 3x return to their LPs over the whole portfolio in a span of 10 years. So you also want to know, where are they in the fund? Because if they're at, say, fund year 4, they're expecting that you are going to sell the company within 5 years or 6 at the very most, right? So you're on a clock. And if you don't feel like it's time to sell the company and they do, guess who wins? They do. So you just need to understand that, and you want to make sure that whatever kind of capital you bring in is aligned with your objectives for the company and the timeline you're on. Does that make sense? With corporates or with family offices as investors, that timeline could be much longer. But again, you want to make sure that you have clear alignment on what your objectives are, because even if the timeline is softer, if your objectives are off by, even a couple of degrees over a period of a few years, guess what? That becomes a very wide gap, right? So we have just a couple minutes. I'd love to hear if, before we turn it over to audience questions, I'd love to hear if any of you have a particularly colorful anecdote you'd like to share, either about how a particular funding relationship was either ideal or disastrous. Either one. Just to give people a sense of what it looks like when it goes really, really well and what it looks like when it goes badly. Anybody want to offer?
You can go ahead.
Yeah, I have a bad one.
I got a bad one, too. The bad ones are more fun.
Yeah, so I'm currently actually in it right now. So one of the main things that when I talk to companies who are interested in this type of funding, one thing I look for is like, okay, do you have the networks and have you built that foundation that you can leverage and that, you can, people, who are hopefully going to bring eventually more than capital, as Edison was saying, but do you have these networks to kind of help your raise and kind of, as soon as you go live, you can talk to them. And so one of the companies I was talking to, we were on the phone, like, first call, and they were like, oh, yeah, like, the CEO has all these distributors. They're all, international. He has lists and lists and lists. And so, this was kind of early on in my time. So I was like, that's great. Like, they're going to go live. They're going to do really well. Our network's going to see the traction. They're going to like it. It has been the biggest flop of like all time. For some reason, all these people who he had all this faith in, no one's showing up. And so I think that kind of speaks to a larger point in terms of there's a difference between having connections and making connections, and really kind of curating your foundation of everything, because he's just, it's ridiculous. He comes to me when he needs something.
So in other words, not sufficient relationship development on either side,
Yeah.
right? And so lots of misunderstandings
Yeah.
that are now really probably going to doom that company.
Yeah.
That's very disappointing for all involved.
Yeah.
Carrie, you were going to offer.
Yeah, and I'll just also follow up on what Lily said. You've got relationships with numbers of people, friends, family, whomever. It's very different when you ask them for money. and so you can really see, when you ask them to write a check, you get to see what that relationship is like. And so this is, we work with a number of different companies. So I've got a number of different ones, but, we've got a company we've worked with who they're right in the middle of, sort of wanting to have that divorce. Because I think what I'll say is just, as much as you think, these funding agencies are checking you out, you need to be checking them out. You need to make sure that you have an alignment, and you need to be ready to say no. You need to be ready to walk away, because they're in a position now where they're funded, but a lot of it is, what are the terms? What's the governance? What's going on? And so they've got money, but it feels like an albatross around their necks because they can't do what they want to do. The focus, we've funded you, so you need to do this, or you need to do that. And they're like, that's not what we want to do. And also, like Julianne said, sometimes it's hard to get a divorce. You may want to have other funders come in and buy them out, but maybe they've got, their warrants and covenants and all these things. So you also be very careful that you have the right people around you, your immediate team, but you also need to have, so many companies I work with, and especially smaller companies, I'm going, well, what did your attorney say? And I was like, we don't have an attorney. I was like, how do you, but there are a lot of, especially really small businesses, you get in. And so I don't care how smart you are, what your PhD is in, if you're not an attorney, you're not an attorney. And so you have to have people looking and reading over, same thing, a CPA or, a bookkeeper, or there are a lot of things that come with running your business. And so just to bring this one back, this company has money, but I think the money as they're looking back at it now, is not worth what they gave up in terms of governance. And it feels like it's, like I said, an albatross or handcuffs around them. And we're trying to help them to work through it, but you just really have to work through it.
Edison, any
Sure.
colorful anecdotes you care to share?
Oh, yeah. So going back to that whole process of building relationships and building trust. And really, I guess my personal experience was I being able to basically identify someone very smart that could add a lot of value to my venture, and I would love to have that person as part of my board. It turns out that this person was actually working to put together a venture fund, a small venture fund, and the whole deal was like, all right, so let's make sure that as we go through this process, I can participate on the business and be part of the venture, and not only that, also bring venture capital to be able to fuel your enterprise. And that was great, worked perfectly, tremendous strategic value, tremendous value add throughout the whole term that she was leading the relationship. And it turns out that somehow, out of the blue, for God knows why, the venture partner decides to sue her for whatever reason, kick her out of the fund, get her out of my board, takes the board seat, shows up in a board meeting, basically with the wonderful plan of, let's sell your business. And you go like, what? How did that happen? So perhaps one of the key things about institutional investment is you're really signing up not with the person that you want, you're really signing up with that fund. And if for whatever reason that person's not around anymore, you're having to deal with the other partners within that fund. So you got to think about the broader implications of that. And then in the end, what end up happening is that you start with the princess, end up with the frog, and how do you deal with that whole situation? And the key challenge is that not only all the idea about selling the business too soon is not something that's feasible, but it also creates a lot of stress, creates a lot of friction, and it is something that end up turning into a whole degradation of that relationship that wasn't solid to begin with to become a personal fight. And because it's not that easy to get rid of the investor, as we talked about, like you go through a whole process that when everything is going well, it's great, but if something goes wrong, then you end up dealing most of the time with bullshit rather than really getting your venture to market. So if for whatever reason you're doing really, really well in the marketplace to the point that your competitors see that and they decide to do a shakedown lawsuit to basically try to get some advantage on you. And while you go through that whole process, you have that investor and board member that rather than looking into the competitor and recognizing the problem that and really what they're up to and the whole motivation behind that, that she's actually blaming you for being sued for whatever they came up with, and rather than offering help, just kind of trying to pin you down all the time and make your life very difficult. So long story short, after a couple of years, perhaps you're finally able to get another finance, and then with that, dilute that investor, get them out of the board, but the time and energy and that you spend doing that really takes a toll on you. And as a young business, mostly a venture-backed business, one of your most valuable assets is time. Time is a non-renewable natural resource that you gotta make the best out of it and recognize that it's priceless. So wasting time dealing with this type of conflicts that are not really moving the venture forward, and things that really happens, like you're driving your car and then suddenly someone just hit you, like you cannot do anything about it, and then having to deal with it, just things that you need to be aware that they happen, and actually they happen much more often than what one would expect. So, if you ever heard about a sitcom called Silicon Valley, and if you watch it, when I did, I was like, holy crap, are they stalking me or what's going on here? But was like, whoa, like all these steps, like exactly the same. And then I start talking to other people and they go like, oh, they also went through that. So it's just part of the journey, but something that, when you're doing that for the first time, it's like a real big deal. And then at the end of the day, you got to take that as something that's just, part of the journey, part of the experience. And you got to make the best out of it. And again, recognizing that if you do get institutional capital, you got to have an exit. And the exit is actually for the better, because after some time, you want to go in a different direction. You don't want to deal with that those people. And the best thing is really to move on and to get on your next big thing.
All right, cool, thank you. Just to kind of amplify Edison's story, it might sound like a telenovela or some other kind of made-up thing, but the very first time I was sued, I was horrified. I couldn't believe I was being sued, or particularly I couldn't believe the flimsiness of the suit. And I consulted a couple of attorneys, all of whom basically said to me, like, what do you mean you've never been sued before? Like, where have you been hiding that you've never been sued before? So this is not to alarm you, just to let you know that things like this do actually happen far too often. And just to be aware that it is actually, it is far too frequently the case that nonsense things like this will in fact bog you down. So, on that very happy note, we have just a few minutes for your questions for the panel, and we have such an amazing panel. I know you're going to want to ask them some. So, who's been holding a question they really want to get answered? Please, sir.
Yeah, like my question is a little bit different, but listen, what made you go back to like giving up the startup entrepreneurship journey and go back to employment?
Sure.
So did everybody hear the question? The question was for Edison, after being an entrepreneur, what enticed him to walk away from being an entrepreneur to take up a job as a corporate VC?
Mm-hmm. Yep, a great question. And it really comes down to timing. And perhaps the key thing was after going through the entrepreneur experience, a couple of things that came out of that. Number one, when you work in your business, you're so focused on it that you kind of, you detach from the broader world. And given the pace of how technology is evolving so fast, when you end up spending 7 to 10 years running that business, and you come out of that, feels like the world has changed. And I was focusing on this little thing and trying to get to my milestones over there. And I need to refresh and to basically catch up with everything that's going on. So as part of that whole process, of course, I mentioned that I kind of took a couple of years off, but I started to think about, all right, so now that I've done this thing, I have the experience, I would love to still be involved with entrepreneurial experience, but I don't want to be focusing just in one. I would love to work with multiple companies. And then out of that, it just came down to, okay, what are the options here? I started to do a lot of mentoring, actually at Greentown Labs, start to mentor a bunch of entrepreneurs there. Really enjoyed that whole experience. Was able to see that it could add a lot of value to those folks, and seeing the challenges that they are facing, things that I've been through, and I was able to give them some advice that helped them move forward. But then what was really funny about that whole thing was then suddenly, I was contacted on LinkedIn out of the blue. A recruiter reached out to me and say, hey, by the way, we have an open position here in Boston. Do you know anybody that would be interested? And I looked into this. It was, hey, here's a position to help us build new ventures that are going to be disruptive in this space. So I was like, tell me more. Went through the whole process, really, understood more about the company culture, what were their expectations, what they were trying to accomplish, really liked the people. And then after that dance, I liked what I saw. They made an offer, I accepted it, and it's something that's still, of course, developing, but I would say that thus far, I'm really impressed with what they're trying to accomplish. And perhaps another key piece about this is that working in energy, one of the key things that I learned is that just the energy environment, the scale of the problem is so big that just, sure, you can start from zero and try to make an impact, but that's a real long road that you're going to go through. So if you're able to, rather than start from zero, be able to lever some of the existing mechanisms or companies, incumbents out there, and be able to accelerate that, I think the results that can be produced will be able to move the needle. So, it's still very aligned with the overall vision mission that I had before, but now, kind of bringing together the best of both worlds. So, yeah, it wasn't really about a corporate job. It was much more about what's the opportunity.
Awesome. That brings us to the end of this segment. So please join me in thanking our amazing panelists. And as you are thinking about funding your businesses, I really encourage you to think about what is the entire trajectory ahead of you. The best way to do that is to look at other companies like the one you are creating that are several years ahead of you, or even mature companies, and look at how much capital and what kinds of capital were necessary to get those companies to where they are now. And think about what are the kinds of capital and the timing of capital that will be necessary to get your company to where you want it to be. And please, please do take advantage of all the resources that are available to you here in the Boston area and beyond to make sure that you are getting the best possible advice and guidance you can that you don't have to pay for. All right? Wishing you all success. Thank you very much.